Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. Welcome to APSR webinar entitled Update on COVID-19 Situation in Asian Pacific region. This is series number 2. On the previous webinar, we learned attempts and approaches against COVID-19 from 5 countries, regions in Asian Pacific area. At this time, we'll share information from physicians on the front line in 6 countries and regions. In addition, at this time, we take more time for the Q&A corner, in which we should be able to get practical and useful information from the battlefield against COVID-19. The presenters in this webinar are as shown in the monitor, you can see. And let's move on to the first presentation, Dr. Ronchan Chen from China. Dr. Chen, please start your presentation.
Okay, and then thanks the introduction of the chairman and dear colleague from the APSR region, and I'm happy to attend this meeting to know each other and to discuss the situation of the COVID-19. And on behalf of Chinese Thoracic Society, and I would like to share with you the epidemiology and prevention strategy of COVID-19 in experience in China. And there's nothing to disclose for me. And first, this slide showing here's the cumulative number of the patients in mainland China. Here's the discharge cases and still inpatient number. It's today the announcement from the whole nation is less than 1,000 in the whole nation, the inland. So around 900 cases still in hospitals. And here's the data from the Wuhan cities. Actually, in the now in Wuhan, there's no patient in hospital now. All clear, and the data from the other area is of Hebei province other than Wuhan, and here's the data from the Shenzhen, the city now I'm working, and it's the city near Hong Kong. So basically, and we have around totally 450 cases, and then now and only 3 cases still in hospitals. So and then look at the newly diagnosed cases all the time. Actually, the whole nation now today. The announcement is 22 new cases, and 21 is imported. Only 1 inland cases, which is due to contact with the imported cases. So the current situation is around each day we face the challenge of imported cases, and on average 20 to 30 cases every day imported from other countries. So and from the Shenzhen, actually we on average we have 1 imported cases each day, but today is 0. So we can see the curve showing there's almost no inside new cases. We are facing some international travelers, the imported case now. we analyzed the curve of newly diagnosis of patient in Shenzhen, where I'm working. And actually, we try to announce the daily new cases since the late of January. And at the early, in the middle of January, we start the preparation of every hospital have the medical staff to receive training on how to diagnose and manage COVID-19 patients. And the whole city begin to early prevention, like everyone travel back to Shenzhen, have to, at the entrance of the city, they have to be check the temperature, they to be follow up. And later on, we strengthen all the prevention strategy, including all the buildings, all the resident communities have some guard showing you have to detect the temperature. You have to wear masks to enter the buildings, and in the hospital we have very strict personal protection equipment to wear. So after the incubation and then the time actually after onset of the illness, on average 5 to 6 days later, the patient will be diagnosed. So we can see including the incubation period and the time for the diagnosis, actually, we can see it take effect and the newly diagnosed cases decline. So I think that the crucial strategy for the success of control outbreak, the early identification of imported cases, the prevention of transmission in the family clusters, because someone travel, say, from Wuhan back to Shenzhen at that time is possible to transmit to the family members. So in case the early imported cases and family cluster, that account for more than 90% of cases. So, and then in the prevention strategy in the public area, and very strong infection control procedure in the hospital. And that the key strategy to control the outbreak in Shenzhen. I think that Shenzhen has done a very successful job, because Shenzhen have a high percentage of migration workers. So more than 10% of the population in Shenzhen is from Wuhan. So in this city, more than 20 million population and high percentage of migration workers, and we can control the epidemic in a short time. That's the experience from my side. And the question raised by through the web, they're showing how exactly mortality rate is still 3%, but not because the COVID-19 is new thing. Then at the early stage, there's no testing to confirm it. Later on, we adjust the criteria for diagnosis, and the mortality actually is now around 5%. But that's the whole nations. In the city like in Guangdong, the mortality is less than 1%. In case we have enough medical resource to cope with the epidemiology, the mortality should be lower than that. And the reason for the disease, the decline of the disease in China, I think, and the prevention strategy in the community and in hospital is that's what I has mentioned. In the strategy in Shenzhen is the same. across the whole mainland China. So and in terms in case the patient is at home, actually I don't know there's any trial can be done in case the patient in at home, because we cannot follow the patient, we cannot evaluate the patients. So all the study, the trial is in the hospital rather than at home. So that's what my presentation. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Dr. Chen. Very, very informative. For me, the decrease of new patients in China was a little bit mysterious. However, in Korea, things very, very similar. And there is one hypothesis that coronavirus in Western country is different from Eastern countries. How do you think about it?
I don't think that's the current data did not support this hypothesis, because there's some countries, the mainland China start in the January, but say in some Western countries they start in March. But in case there's shortage of medical resource, the critical situation, the mortality exact same. So I don't think it's the viral mutation. I think it's the enough preparation and enough medical resource is important and also the strategy to control the transmission.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Chen. Then we will move on to the next presentation. Next presenter is Dr. Roa from Philippines. Please, Dr. Roa, please.
Good evening. Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure to be part of this webinar. And I'd like to report the experience in my country. As you all know, we are part of the this is my disclosure. I have nothing to disclose. Part of APSR as an in-block member of the APSR. I'm referring to the Philippine College of Chest Physicians. And early on in the onset of this problem, we went on as an organization to participate in the national effort to control it. We came up with some guidelines and some activities that will educate our doctors and work with other organizations, ethics, nutrition, to come up with things that we can offer as people are grappling with the disease. We call this the Bayanihan spirit. Bayanihan means everybody works together. Just like in the rural area, we transfer one house to another place depending on who gets married to, mainly by people on their shoulders and no machines. So this is our Bayanihan response to the COVID pandemic. And of course, we were also swamped by the early occurrence of when this thing came to us. We were really unprepared. And we had projections that were so high up that it created actually the specter of something very bad and panic. But somehow with our quarantine, our hospital efforts, we are, I think, flattening the curve. So our latest statistics are still not good, but we have fewer deaths now and more recoveries. And if you look at the resources that we have, we don't have that much, but as you can see, we have enough reserve in the blue. And in our ventilator stockpile, most of our ventilators are in the stock room because only 25% are being used. So we have, after a month and a half, breathing space. And we are able to think through better. We don't have the element of panic and, the need to think of many other things, including resources, because we have some. And we try to look at our experience and the experience in other countries, especially China, in how we can be guided to go forward in managing these conditions. For example, like what has been reported, most of the fatalities are actually in the older age group. We do have middle-aged adults having it, but you can see in our country, this is a relatively young population. Our life expectancy is much lower than that of China and Japan. So maybe that added to our reduced deaths. But while we saw that age itself is an indicator for higher, the older age group, higher mortality rate or case fatality rate, we also know that from the data in China that if we take off comorbidity, the outcome could be better. So we now know that as we look at COVID patients coming in the hospital and even in the ICU, we really work hard to control the comorbidities. And we have a group amongst us, volunteers, that actually attempt to tell us what we can do. This is a volunteer group of ABM practitioners that day after day came up with some recommendations. But I have to tell you, even if the data out there for hydrochloroquine is not really that positive, the fact that we somehow need something else something to be given for the virus, put this drug still in our guideline, but maybe we'll have more information as the days pass. We are also very much aware that this disease can transfer even in the asymptomatic phase. So we are repurposing some of our old buildings, including TB buildings with high ceiling or big windows, to be quarantining this milder asymptomatic case. And we ask everybody to do a mask when they ever get out, because this is a virus that spread even before they become symptomatic. And my country is one of the highest prevalence of tuberculosis. So we do have this concern that with the coming in of the COVID, we will have a problem with our tuberculosis. The sources will be for COVID. Testing will be difficult because everybody would like to make sure there is no COVID. That fear is not only in the medtechs, but also in the doctors. We know we have a challenge ahead, and we will be guided with what's out there in terms of what the expert would tell us to go farther down this line. But we have to consider this. And finally, this is my last slide. That as we travel along, go through to confront this virus, we try to learn as much as we can, adapt as we can possibly do. We have the evidence-based people telling us what to do. For those with critical illness, we put them in the hospital. And then this is our university hospital, repurposed for that. And we have sports centers and TB facilities for the mild. We grapple with the test capability. So far, we are doing molecular testing to the level of only 7,000 a day. That's very low. We have our own people coming up with the kits, but these are not enough. We want some more. We know we need that. Clinically, we have the symptoms that are sometimes non-specific. So we look at tests, laboratory tests, X-rays for one. Sometimes you see it early. Best if there is CT scan, but then it's expensive. We are aware that the cytokine storm will suddenly tip off patients, so we anticipate that. In terms of oxygen, we don't look at only the values, but look at how the patient is taking it, because we want to delay intubation or avoid it as much as possible. We mentioned already comorbidities. We look at the toxicities of drugs. And then when we try to delay intubation, we have to really do other things like proning. We joined the solidarity trial to have more idea whether the drugs are working. is the high flow nasal oxygen that we use now to delay ventilation. And then we have other things that are being applied, like hemoperfusion, based on what our local experts are saying. I have to tell you, the one thing that we have here is that the National Health Insurance is really supporting us in these measures. So with that, I'd like to end my formal presentation. But I got these two questions that I have to answer from our chairman. The practicality of the antigen rapid test kits as compared to the molecular test, and how will COVID-19 end eventually? Let me answer the first question first. So if we all know that the virus, when you detect it, it's equivalent to having the disease because you have the virus. Okay, and this usually lasts for 3 to 8 weeks. Okay, when you have a positive IgM, then easily you can see that you still have to do the reverse transcriptase molecular test, because this is still a patient who is sick. So it does not tell us much whether the patient has COVID or not. When you have the IgG alone, and that's okay, maybe the patient's recovered, but then that may be in this part here. So we still don't know. So my message is we have a problem using the antibody test, especially at this time when we still have the ongoing transmission and actual, we just are going down initially in this part of the outbreak, the pandemic. And really, this is really for later phases, I think. And what about those who are negative for this antibody or that test? I would even think that if you have exposure and if they develop some symptoms, then we actually just repeat the molecular rather than do the antibody test. How will this all end? I would like to present to you what happened in the 1980s, 1990s with the pandemic, bigger pandemic. It's so big that it probably created a herd immunity. And then it became a low endemic circulating for the next 4 years. But before that, there were some waves. And look at the second wave, the third wave, there are high mortalities there. Then it became endemic until the next virus totally extinguished it. No, people don't understand why it disappeared with the next virus. Here comes SARS-1. SARS-1, more virulent. But the thing about SARS-1 is that the person is already obviously sick before he transmits. So isolation was very important. Then there's another pandemic, another H1N1 variety. And because this is known, they have already a vaccine. So the vaccine stopped the infection right there and there, almost. Now we have COVID-19. Now, problem with COVID-19 is isolation becomes very challenging because they actually can be transmitted even in asymptomatic. Okay, so what do we need? Well, we try as much as possible to hide those, isolate those with the disease, test, diagnose, isolate. We try to look for drugs that will make the condition less fatal or less severe. But really the answer is vaccine. So that's my answer. How will this end? We end when we have a vaccine, and that's not coming in the next very soon. It will take probably more than a year or two.
Okay. Dr. Rua, thank you very much for a very, very excellent presentation. So next time, let's move on to the next presenter. Next presenter is Dr. Raymond Liu from Hong Kong. Dr. Liu, please.
Yeah, I'm Dr. Liu from Hong Kong. And thank you very much for giving me the pleasure to present the current situation in Hong Kong. At present, we have a mitigation phase in Hong Kong. And at present, so far, we have over 1,000 cases, confirmed cases in Hong Kong. And most of them have been discharged. And 700 patients have left the hospital. And about 200 odd patients still hospitalized, and most of them are stable. Only 4 patients are critically ill in the intensive care units, and 1 patient is on ECMO. and there are 4 deaths. So we have a very low death rate in Hong Kong. And you can see that we have about 1,000 isolation beds in Hong Kong. And so far, only a quarter of them are occupied. And one of the major key issues in Hong Kong for control is that we do widespread testing. And you can see that in January, we only performed about 3,000 tests. And in April, we now have tested more than nearly 50,000 patients in Hong Kong. And in my hospital, we tested 6 rounds each day. And we also started to perform rapid tests since last week. And this is the age distribution of confirmed cases in Hong Kong. We isolated them early, and so you can see that most of our patients are in a younger age group from 20-odds to 50s. And what is our current containment strategy? And it's unprecedented that Hong Kong people are so disciplined that they universally wear masks in Hong Kong. And most of them do scrupulous hand hygiene. And we impose ban to all non-Hong Kong residents coming from overseas since March, when there was a sharp rise in confirmed cases. And we do compulsive deep throat saliva testing to all people entering Hong Kong through airports. In the present, we impose compulsory home quarantine 14 days for all returning back to Hong Kong. And we have early close contact isolation and quarantine to prevent community outbreak. And we practice social distancing. We close bars, and we introduce spacing in restaurants. We close school early and universities early as after Chinese New Year. And we encourage home office. So what is the hospital level strategy? We perform widespread testing, as I mentioned before, and we set up tents at AED, and we started introducing a rapid test since last week. And from frontline workers' point of view, we always active sourcing adequate PPE for all frontline staff working in the hospital, especially in the isolation wards. Most of our patients receive early antiviral treatment in Hong Kong. For example, in our hospital, all of our patients on average receive antiviral treatment as about 5 days from symptom onset. And many of them have resolving of symptoms, including fever, within a few days. And most of the patients actually have very rapidly reducing viral loads. And common antiviral drugs that we're using are Calitra, Ribavirin, and interferon. And we found that the triple therapy actually lowered the viral load very effectively when you treat them early. And then selective centers also using remdesivir in study. And for ill patients, we now have tocilizumab and convalescent plasma ready for them. And we also increased our isolation beds capacity from 1,000 to 1,500 during early April to cope with the increasing demand at the time. So what is our current post-COVID follow-up and monitoring of potential reinfection? Currently, we see all our patients early in our, especially in our outpatient clinic, and we ask them all the symptoms. We tested them when they have any symptoms, recurrence of symptoms, and also we monitor all the chest X-ray. And we found that out of 1,038 patients, we found 9 patients what we call reinfection. That means that we tested them positive after they've been discharged from the hospital. But all these patients are either asymptomatic or very mild symptoms. We found that there's CT values around 26 to 37. And majority of them have a very high CT value of over 30. And none of them have a positive viral culture. So we believe that these patients are either non-infectious or have very low infectivity. But we will continue monitoring them in future. What we now ask our patients to do is, when they have been discharged from hospital, we encourage them to stay 2 weeks at home. And also, we ask them not to go out and wear masks all the time. And second question is the state of concept herd immunity, considering the fact that the cured patients can get reinfected. Well, I think there's no hard evidence that herd immunity can curb COVID-19. And currently, all our patients who have been labeled reinfected, we believe that they're not infective at all. So considering herd immunity, well, at present stage, Hong Kong has very few confirmed cases. So I don't believe that we have any evidence that herd immunity work at this moment in time. And so we're not practicing any herd immunity concept at all. So this is the end of my presentation.
So let's move on to the next presenter, Dr. Füsun Ona Eylboglu from Turkey. Dr. Eylboglu, please start the presentation.
Okay, this is Füsun Eylboglu from Turkey Başkent University, and I'm a member of Turkish Thoracic Society. It's a pleasure to me to be here with APSR organization, and I would like to thank to the organizers for the invitation of me and Turkish Thoracic Society. I have nothing to declare and nothing. No disclosures about this talk. So as we had the first case on 11th of March, up to today, we had 114 cases, new cases, and of these 1,621 of them were in ICU, and of these 845 patients were intubated. So of these total 114,000 patients, we had like 3,000 total deaths. And for now, the recovery of the patients is around 39,000. So as we had the disease later than the other countries, we had the chance to observe what's going on in other countries. And at the middle of January, Ministry of Health decided to establish a scientific board for COVID-19. And the Ministry of Health was the sole authority in the outbreak management. And we had time to observe and monitor the outbreak around the world. So it arrived 2.5 months later in our country, and we had time for preparedness of preparing a guideline for COVID-19, and we created algorithms for the healthcare workers, and we get prepared for producing our own PCR test in our central virology laboratory, and we got prepared our hospitals and the number of ICU beds. Also, we prepared enough personal protective equipment, and we get ready in terms of treatment, in terms of having the drugs who need it. And as we were watching the outbreak around the other countries, first we started to get action against limiting the mobility to other countries. And as we had the disease on 11th of March, then we started to get action against limiting mobility inside the country. So we first closed the schools and universities and restricted going out of the people over age 65 years old. And we implemented a curfew to the youngs under the age of 20. And we started to begin, by the beginning of April, do a curfew for the weekends. And this is our number of new patients, and this is our death rate. So this preparedness and this guidance has provided a standardized approach all over the country towards suspected and diagnosed COVID cases, and also diagnosis and treatment are free for all of our COVID cases. So let's start with the testing. As I said, we had accumulative as like 1 million tests done so far, and the total testing, when we look to the OECD countries, and the other countries, tests amounts per 1,000 population is here, or mostly above 10, but we are in terms of testing 1,000 population, like our rate is 5.3. And first we trusted the PCR testing a lot. We thought that the susceptibility and sensitivity was high, but we got the results like the positive results was to 11 to 12%. And at this time, currently, I can say that we need to improve this testing. And the sensitivity and specificity was around 50 to 60%. So we had the feeling that we are missing some patients with COVID symptoms and positive CT findings. This graph shows the cumulative death numbers, which is around 3,000 now, versus ICU, and among them those intubated ones. So at the first 2 weeks, we started with standard regimens as recommended from our colleagues like China and other Asian countries. We started with hydroxychloroquine, azithromycin, and etc. But we saw that things are not going very well for all our patients. And but we realized that we had the favipiravir, and it was recommended to use only in patients in the ICU or the intubated ones. But we started to use this antiviral earlier, and we started to use it. We just give it every hospital at the beginning of April. And as you see, the number of ICU patients are getting increased, but I wouldn't say the same for the number of intubated among them. And we started to give favipiravir earlier, and it made, I would say, an important and significant difference in terms of patients intubating. When we look to the infection fatality rate versus current percent of all cases in the ICU and the intubated ones, you see our infection fatality rate is around 2.3 to 2.4, but the number of ICU patients and the number of intubated patients are getting decreased. And again, when we look to the doubling times and time-dependent doubling times of cumulative number of COVID-19 cases and deaths, we saw that the doubling time for new cases during March was 2 days, and the doubling time for deaths was 2 days. But in April, the doubling time for new cases was 6 days, and the deaths was the doubling time was 7 days. So this month we are getting better. The major reason is, as my colleague said, we started earlier the treatment of antiviral drugs. And again, we were just avoiding the high flow oxygen treatment at first, but then we started to move on and starting the treatment early in terms of high flow oxygen or non-invasive mechanical ventilation. And this slide shows the case fatality rate, which is decreasing, and versus the case recovery rate. And you see the scissors open between the CFR and the CRR. So we are getting there. We have recoveries, and the number of deaths are decreasing. So these slides were upon the data which our Ministry of Health has given, and but in the hospitals in many cities, my colleagues from Turkish Thoracic Society, while we were talking, we realized that there must be something missing in terms of the exact COVID patient, determining the exact COVID patients. Because we are still using the criteria for diagnosis of COVID-19, the PCR positivity. And we all noticed that cases with COVID symptoms and CT findings, but negative PCR, get diagnoses other than COVID. So, when we looked to that, to evaluate that, we realized that 60% of our patients is from Istanbul, the biggest city of Turkey. And we recorded, they found that Istanbul recorded 2,100 more deaths over recent days between March and April, according to the previous 4 years. So you see the number of deaths. But it's not matching with the number of deaths due to COVID-19. So this showed us something. We are missing, we have missing numbers of COVID cases and deaths as they have negative PCR testing, and also patients with serious health problem may avoid seeking medical care during outbreak, and they die at home due to collateral complications. And as a summary, I can say that for my country, we are good at patient care and treatment, but we need to improve our testing in terms of quality and quantity. And it would be informative to take into consideration all patients with diagnosis of possible COVID-19 and recalculate and analyze the patient data, including cases and deaths, would be very helpful. I would like to thank you again for your invitation. And our chair has a question to me. When do you think travel and gathering restrictions should end? I would say we should implement we should measure the implementations, and we should keep on this quarantine curfews. and we should be very careful about continue the isolation. And I would say by the end of June, maybe we will take a breath and say we can travel and gather together, but everything should be step by step. We all have to loosen up the rules very, very slowly, I would say. And the other question was, when can I expect COVID-19 vaccine? There are, as you all know, ongoing 140 studies, and I would say it wouldn't be earlier than a year. Thank you very much for the invitation again. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Especially you have mentioned about the missing number of COVID-19. It is very interesting and a very, very important issue, I think. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Then we move on to the next presentation. Dr. Yang Jen Cho, Korea.
Hi, hello, I'm Young Jae-jo from Seoul National University Bundang Hospital in South Korea. Thank you for inviting me this webinar. This is the current state of the COVID-19 in South Korea until Monday of this week, and totally about 10,700 confirmed cases and 240 death cases were recorded, and about 600,000 people have been tested, and the test positive rate is 1.8%. And if you look at the global trend on the right side, and this graph is displayed as a log scale. And in the case of the death, I think Korea is seem to have reached a certain degree of saturation, but sporadic cases is still occurring. Korea has passed 100 days since the first patient occurred, but in April, daily new cases is gradually decreasing. It is already well known there have been revolutionary results in the coronavirus test in Korea. The world's first drive-through test site was created, and recently some hospital has created a separate testing booth, and the graph below shows the current status of test in Korea, and the total population of Korea is about 50 million, so the test was being conducted only about 1 or 2% of total population. Of course, there was a local outbreak in Korea as well. On the 17th of February, the one patient occurred in the Gyeongbuk area, but case has exploded in a month since then. And in the mid-March, there were more than 200 patients admitted to ICU nationwide. And right now, more than 90% of all deaths still occur in the surgery area. Case fatality rate in Korea is about 2.3%. I think anyway, it is relatively low compared to other countries. Although this graph and table have not been officially announced, but since the total number of domestic ICU patients peaked in the mid-March, about 50 hospitals have established a network of ICU specialists through domestic social networking service. Then shared the patients who were receiving oxygen, ventilator, or ECMO, and the total number of ICU patients in each intensive care every day. At the same time, we continuously count the number of available empty beds in each hospital, and then we compare the number to the previous day's number and figure out whether the proportion of critical ill patients does increase or not, and maximizing effective and appropriate medical resource allocation. Briefly, I want to show my hospital experience how to treat the critically ill COVID patient. And since the MERS outbreak, we have placed national quarantine units in 29 hospitals across the country. And my hospital has a total 9 beds as the national quarantine unit. And this unit is figured to receive up to 5 patients for intensive care. And within this bed, we prepare to perform all the procedures such as bronchoscope and ultrasound or ECMO or inhaled nitric oxide. So in fact, this case was the patient who suddenly came to our hospital from the surgery area. And after a long treatment for a month, the patient recovered and returned to the original area. And so in my opinion, the patient transportation between surgery area and non-surgery area like this has contributed to lowering overall case fatality in a part. And I gathered simple data of COVID patients who received the mechanical ventilation from my colleague. And this result is about 96 patients from 20 institutions. And so on average, 11 patients per hospital in the surgery area, compared with 2.5 patients in non-surgery area were treated in ICU. And so very unexpectedly, the 1 month survival rate of the patient in ICU was more than 70%, and 40% of this patient could be extubated. So this is entirely my personal opinion, but most COVID dead patients in Korea did not enter ICU, and maybe they are likely to die in DNR condition at secondary hospital or nursing home with receive hospice care. I'd like to introduce the Korean COVID-19 smart management system. It collects and classifies the information based on various data sources and delivered to the Korean CDC. So we can have more speed up tracking contactors and clouding all information with the mobile app. And through this, it was possible to shorten the epidemiological investigation from 24 hours in manual method to only 10 or 15 minutes. I think because of the COVID-19, SMS also contributed to effective mitigation strategy accompanied by social distance recommendation. As a result, the number of confirmed cases in Korea has decreased rapidly. And as you can see, recently most cases in Korea were confirmed through the International Airport Quarantine Office came from the United States or Europe. Currently, even the number is maintained at around or under 10. How to prepare for future in South Korea? I think the first is to maintain social distance in everyday ordinary life. And right now, our government is promoting these recommendations to the public. And more specifically, we need definitely an accurate and specific antibody test for the post-infectious cases. And then for severe or critical patients, actually we learned from this case surgery outbreak, so we have to reorganize the critical care system. And particularly this time in South Korea, it was possible to effectively prevent infection by separating the mild patient from their family, placing a special place we called the Life Treatment Center between home and hospital. And also we are further reviewing a kind of respiratory or fever clinic or a secure COVID-free hospital for non-COVID general population. And lastly, I think we should invest more research funds to accelerate the development of the antiviral, viral, or immunomodulating agent. and COVID-19 vaccine for everyone. Okay, this is my end of slide, and I have the 3 questions from the committee. And the number 1 is which one is more beneficial, high flow nasal cannula or early intubation? And what is the parameter and timing for early intubation? And the first question, my answer is the high flow nasal cannula has definitely advantage for COVID-19 patients because there are some issue about the aerosol producing in high flow nasal cannula, but I think simple additional surgical mask can solve the problem. And if the case is surgery for critical care and the resource is very scarce, such as ventilator or ECMO, so high flow nasal cannula can saving the resource. And even through the rapid sequence intubation, under high flow nasal cannula, we can do the safer procedure. And the last one is in the high flow nasal cannula system, we can have the less nursing care compared by on the mechanical ventilator. And so how to avoid the delayed intubation? And I will suggest some 3 recommendations. Number 1 is the LOX index, is a kind of the research from the LOCA et al. And so this index is useful. And the imaging is the ultrasound imaging in my ICU. So I use the point of care lung ultrasound for avoid delayed intubation. And I think this is a useful method. And the last is if you use the oxygen reservoir index, if some available device can show this index. So I think this is the last one. And number 2 question is how about the cytokine filter? So this is no, I don't have any experience. And I think in South Korea, many hospitals does not have experience of the cytokine filter. And the number 3 question is what's the main reason why COVID-19 decreasing in Korea? So I'm not sure, but the number 1 is that we had the MERS experience, and the experience this experience will help to develop especially the diagnostic kit, such as PCR. And like other country, the universal mask apply and hand wash, and active participation of whole people for all kinds of social distancing. And actually government-driven factor also is working. And as I mentioned, we develop a kind of the live treatment center between home and hospital. And so this is aggressive quarantine. And the last is our ICU preparedness is working still. So I think this is why the COVID-19 decreasing in South Korea. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Cho. Yeah, Korea is just front runner of this disease for the treatment. And it was very, very interesting and informative for us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Then we move on to the next presenter, Dr. Sar Hong Phua from Singapore. Dr. Phua, please start your presentation.
Hi, thanks again for the invitation from the APSR to give this presentation. And I'm honored to be able to share with you the Singapore experience and situation as of now. So again, I've got nothing to disclose for this presentation at all. So in Singapore, we first saw our first patient on the 23rd of January in 2020. So I think among the Asian countries, we are probably one of the first to get hit outside China. And as you can see, our experience showed that initially we experienced a lot of imported cases, but that has flattened out. Then eventually the community cases started to come out as the imported cases started mingling with the community. Now, as the cases started to go up, the government has taken into strict measures to try to suppress the community spread. So the social distancing between 1 meter to 2 meters. Of course, now we are enforced to wear masks everywhere we go, even anywhere outside of your home. You're enforced to wear a mask. And of course, a lot of people are working from home now. Schools are closed as well. But what has been interesting is that if you notice the bottom bar, actually what's really been contributing to the numbers are that the dorm resident numbers have started to go up. Now, who are the dorm residents? Actually our blue-collar workers who are, unfortunately, I mean, they come from foreign country and they all are staying in these dorms. They're housed in dorms where there's large numbers of people. So Singapore introduced something called the circuit breaker at the beginning of April. And that's when all the stay-home notices started happening. And we suspect that because of that, a lot of the companies have to close down and most people start staying at home. And because the dorm workers stay in large communities and they're quite close-knit, and the dorm numbers started to come up. So this is as of 25th of April. As you can see, the dorm workers, the numbers actually started exponentially climb. The local community cases were sort of flattening out already at this point of time. So one of the things now is that we are having two groups and two cohorts that we are dealing with now. The first, initially we started off with the imported cases, but then it became the community cases. Now we have to deal with two cases now, the community cases and the dorm cases. So what's been happening now to help our dorm workers to combat the illness, we've been building community isolation facilities. So as you can see, we are converting all our previous halls where we had expos and talks into areas where we can actually house these patients. We are building up temporary sites so that we can house all these patients as well. A lot of resorts and some of the older hospitals have been converted into isolation facilities also. Now, our country, although it's a really tiny dot around the whole world, we actually have about 8 local hospitals in the whole country. This is excluding private hospitals. And the main center where we deal with all the COVID patients are in the National Center for Infectious Diseases. And it is actually linked to this hospital called Tan Tock Seng Hospital where I work in. Now the bed capacity for the National Center for Infectious Diseases is about 330 beds. And now we have expanded to about 586 beds just to accommodate for patients who require some medical care. Now the ICU bed in the National Center is about 38 capacity, but in combination with Tan Tock Seng Hospital, we have actually expanded and are prepared to take in about 188 beds, patients now. And this is only in our center and excluding all the other hospitals. Together, we probably would see about we are probably about 300 to 400 beds ready for in case we have a surge in ICU patients. So the numbers we're seeing as of yesterday is that we have seen about 14,951 positive cases. Now about 7.3% of these cases have been discharged well, and 9.7% of them are still currently admitted. The remaining are currently housed in these isolation facilities. Now, my talk is centric, and I'll give you a little bit more of our observations within the ICU itself. 88 patients as of the outbreak had required invasive mechanical ventilation. So our intubation rates is about 0.59%. We had about 14 deaths since the outbreak started, out of which 7 of patients actually passed away while they were still being managed in ICU. The remaining 7 passed away outside of ICU, and this is for various reasons, and mostly had a do not resuscitate order. So in essence, if you actually take the whole numbers in totality, our mortality rate is about 0.1%. And if you just look at the ICU admissions, the intubated patients, the mortality rate is about 8%. Now, this just came out in today's newspaper, and as mentioned before, what we are actually seeing now is that we're actually trying to divide the cases because we find that these two cohorts are very different cohorts altogether, the community cohort and the case from the dormitories. Now, you can see the large numbers are from dormitories, and we are actually quite thankful, quite fortunate that these patients are actually quite young, and they're quite fit, and they're quite well with hardly any comorbidities. And we are hoping, more praying that these patients don't actually end up coming to the ICU eventually. Now, I just want to share some of the characteristics of our ICU patients. These are unpublished data, but we did have a quick comparison with our well patients versus our patients that required mechanical ventilation. And we found that, of course, most of them are older, just like, and all the publications so far, and of course, all our esteemed colleagues that have presented so far, I think we shared similar experience where our patients in the ICU tend to be older, and 80% of our patients tend to be 60 years old and above. They're all mostly male. About 70% of our ICU intubated patients were male. And although these are all intuitive, but we have proven that as compared to the well patients, they are more dyspneic, they have higher temperatures, they are more tachycardic, and they have a higher respiratory rate. And what we found that patients who come into ICU had a higher neutrophil counts. Those who are well and remain in the wards or in the isolation facilities, their neutrophil counts don't tend to raise up so high. One of the postulations and theory is that perhaps that once you hit an ARDS-like picture, once you have to come into the ICU, the inflammatory response towards the insult from the virus actually starts skyrocketing, and the inflammatory response causes your neutrophil counts to go up. They have profound lymphopenia, most of the time less than 1. Of course, a raised lactate dehydrogenase. Of course, the neutrophil lymphocyte ratio tends to be on the high side, and most patients that come into the intensive care unit have a high C-reactive protein. Everybody that came to the ICU had presence of air space shadows and chest X-ray. One of our main things that we notice is that the amount of hypoxemia these patients actually experience do not correlate with the radiological changes. As compared to ARDS, where your X-ray changes can be really profoundly white, consolidated, these guys tend to have a bit more ground glass changes, bilateral, and it's just quite widespread across, but it's just not very dense. Yet they will require 100% of oxygen. And initially, when the outbreak started, we started them on high peaks while on the ventilator. But interestingly, despite the degree of hypoxemia, we found that the driving pressures tend to be still low, less than 15 across the board, and the plateau pressures tend to be on the lower side, less than 30. And our median plateau pressures was roughly about 11. And again, I think this is very similar to what other countries around the world are experiencing as well. And what we found is that prone works. It works really well. And once we prone patients who require high oxygen requirements, the oxygen, the saturation actually improves. In fact, we find that once we put them back on the supine position, their oxygen requirements go back up again. One of the things that we notice is that post-extubation, and once they're in the general undergoing rehabilitation, some patients actually do experience some autodeoxia. There are some patients that experience exertional desaturations as well. And we had a couple of scares where actually the patients only required 2 liters of oxygen via nasal cannula, but had to be escalated to a venturi mass of 50%. But that came down quite quickly after, once we recognized the autodeoxia in these patients. Our tracheostomy rate is about 6.8%, and about 15 patients out of the 88 required some form of dialysis. So that is the brief summary on the situation within Singapore. We are still battling and grappling with the current rise in numbers. But despite the numbers looking that it's going up quite exponentially, the community cases are actually flattening out, it's actually coming down. And we are keeping a close eye on our dorm workers because they are one of the backbones of the country. And we hope that they remain well throughout and continue to observe them and treat them accordingly. Now, similarly with the rest of the other presenters, I also had these questions from the organization. And the question for me was that my experience using non-invasive ventilation like high flow nasal cannula for acute hypoxemic respiratory failure. So at the beginning of the outbreak, we were quite strict on the usage of high flow nasal cannula and non-invasive ventilators. We tried to avoid them because of the worry of aerosolization and dispersion, droplet dispersion within these modalities. But lately, the last 4 to 6 weeks, we are using more and more high flow nasal cannulas because we realized by helping their hypoxemia, they actually tend to do a bit better. And in fact, with the high flow nasal cannula, they actually, we managed to staff off some of the intubations. Now, interestingly, not only are we starting them on high flow nasal cannula, we're actually doing awake prone ventilation now. So on high flow nasal cannula, we actually put them on a prone position, and actually we find that their oxygenation improved really remarkably. In fact, we're actually now doing this for patients only on 2 to 4 liters of oxygen on nasal cannula in the general ward. If there's any need for oxygenation as well at all, we have protocol in the ward where we actually ask the patients to try to lie on their belly at least 5 times a day. Hopefully they can last for an hour. It's not a very comfortable position to be in, especially if you're not used to it. But if they can tolerate the position, they can go on for longer periods of time. Anecdotally, that experience has been good, and we have got reports from patients that says that they are actually doing this on their own now without even being asked to. So about 36.6% of our patients in the National Center of Infectious Diseases required the usage of the high flow nasal cannula. And out of that 36.6%, about 40% of that at the end ended up being intubated. What about the usage of steroids just for COVID-19 pneumonia? I must say at this juncture, in my center at least, we have not used steroids specifically for COVID-19 pneumonia. Our usage of steroids are mainly to deal with patients who come in with shock that require high inotropic requirements. In regards to the usage on convalescence plasma, this I must say belongs to the decision belongs to the infectious disease department in my hospital. We work together in the ICU, and we only gave it once so far, and that was given over the weekend. So it's a really new experience for us. But the patient that we gave it to was really sick. She was on FiO2 100% with a PEEP of 12. And I think her tube pressures and driving pressures were already climbing up. She did not qualify for remdesivir because we are actually participating in that trial. And because of that, her inflammatory markers were still climbing up. We actually gave tocilizumab, and I think she was just too sick, and we didn't want to lose her. So the trial, she was given convalescence plasma over the weekend. But I'm happy to report today that her oxygen requirements actually did come down. Again, this is just anecdotal experience for one patient, and I mean, we hope to see around the world and hopefully to learn from everybody else if they have got further experience with convalescence plasma, and if there's waiting quite closely for the trials for the tocilizumab and remdesivir trials. With that, I end my presentation. Thanks very much for your attention, and stay safe, everybody.
Thank you, Dr. Puro. Very, very excellent presentation, and mortality rate less than 0.1% was so amazing. Thank you very much. And I would express a sincere appreciation to all the presenters. Very, very informative and excellent. Thank you so much. And Dr. Azuma, could you summarize today's webinar?
Yes, thank you very much for your introduction. First of all, I'd like to express a sincere appreciation and a thanks to all contribution, all participants. I'd like to, on behalf of the Education Committee of APSR, I'd like to briefly summarize this session. A summary of the social problem. We have seen some initial success in fighting against the COVID-19 in some Asian Pacific area, particularly in Singapore and China, and also Hong Kong. This is a very important thing, strict isolation and strict first testing and the faster contacting monitoring. This is very important things. Foremost importance would be engagement of a public observing healthcare measure like wearing a surgical mask, hygiene, hand hygiene, and social distances. This is a individual very important things. Communication and the level, collaboration at the multiple level, government and the society and the community level, all essential for success and sustained fighting against the COVID-19 pandemic. healthcare professionals deserve support from the government and the population is also important things. But we would like to know the next slide, the medical problem, the pathology of this COVID-19. This is very important, but still unknown. Respectively, there is two phases, rapid progression. In some patients, there are some rapid progression in some patients, but there are some positive patients without symptomatic. Without symptom is a dormant carrier. Is a very accurate heel published in the New England Journal. Dr. Lowe mentioned. One of the therapeutic targets is a reduction of the severe and fatal progression, particularly in aged people. Vaccination and antivirus agent development is very important, but a prediction of severity is clinically is very important things. In advanced cases, blood purification as a perfusion for or cytokine storm and hypercoagulopathy is very important in the severe cases. We would like to share the information of COVID-19 management leading to fighting against the virus. Thank you again for your all contribution. Keep in touch with us. Thank you very much.
1